Throw it all in the dumpster. I am not running a charity hospice for your pathetic mother. Get this garbage out of my sight before I do it myself. Declan ripped the heavy, hand-stitched antique quilt from my hands, his fingers digging into the fragile embroidered fabric so violently I heard the ancient threads snap. With a sharp, guttural exhale, he shoved me backward onto the hallway's cold, hardwood floor. I was 36 years old. My knees struck the oak planks with a sickening, hollow thud that radiated a deep, blooming ache all the way up my thighs. My dark hair was coated in a fine, glittering layer of pink fiberglass dust that itched my scalp, and I was staring up at the towering silhouette of the man I had slept next to, cooked for, and desperately tried to placate for 9 long years. "Declan, please," I gasped, the air completely knocked out of my lungs, my palms burning from the friction of the floor. "That quilt belonged to my grandmother. It's the only thing my mother has left of her." "I don't care if it belonged to the Tsar of Russia." Declan spat. His face flushed a deep, ugly crimson, the veins in his thick neck pulsing visibly against his collar. He kicked the quilt toward the staircase. "It smells like sickness. This whole house smells like a waiting room for a morgue. It's disgusting." 5 minutes earlier, an insurance appraiser had climbed down from the retractable ladder of our attic. The appraiser hadn't said a single word to my husband, who was yelling on his cell phone in his locked home office. The appraiser had just walked straight to me in the kitchen, his heavy, calloused hands physically shaking, and pressed a heavy, dust-covered black metal lockbox directly into my chest. He had leaned in close, smelling of rain and stale peppermint, and whispered that I needed to pry it open before the police did. Inside that freezing cold metal box was a $333,000 secret. It was a secret that perfectly explained why my deaf daughter's incredibly expensive hearing aids kept mysteriously disappearing, why our mortgage company had been calling my cell phone at odd hours, and why Declan had been so adamant about isolating me from the outside world. But Declan didn't know I had the box. He didn't know the appraiser had found anything up in the darkness of the rafters. He just kept screaming at the top of his lungs, his expensive leather dress shoes systematically kicking my mother's expensive, neatly stacked boxes of medical supplies, sterile gauze, saline solution, and backup oxygen tubing, down the carpeted stairs. He was completely, utterly confident that he had won. He looked at me on the floor, breathing heavily, entirely satisfied by the sight of my bruised knees and my bowed head. To understand why letting him destroy my home that rainy afternoon was the most brilliant, calculated thing I have ever done in my entire existence, you have to understand how completely invisible I had been my entire life. My name is Oksana Volkov. I am the daughter of a Russian immigrant who spent 40 years scrubbing the scuffed linoleum floors of commercial office buildings in the dead of night so I could have a fraction of a normal life. And I am the fiercely protective mother of Mila, a 7-year-old girl with bright, inquisitive green eyes who was born profoundly deaf. Most people look at me and see a very quiet, very tired woman. They see the dark circles bruised under my eyes, the modest, inexpensive gray cardigans I wear to hide my frame, and the way I instinctively make myself smaller when I walk into a crowded room. I work as a court reporter here in the sprawling, humid concrete labyrinth of Charlotte, North Carolina. I sit in the dimly lit corner of a heavily paneled courtroom for 8 grueling hours a day. I stare at the blank keys of a stenography machine, my fingers moving in complex phonetic chords, typing out the absolute worst, most agonizing moments of other people's lives. My entire profession fundamentally requires me to be a ghost. I am paid to witness destruction. I don't speak when the defense attorney screams. I don't react when the weeping mother takes the witness stand. I don't flinch when the gruesome crime scene photos are displayed on the projector. I just sit in the shadows, breathing the sterile, heavily air-conditioned air, and I record every single lie, every single evasion, every single threat. But people fundamentally misunderstand what it means to be quiet. They equate silence with a lack of intelligence. They think silence is an inherent weakness. They look at a woman who doesn't argue back, and they assume she has surrendered. They think if you aren't yelling, you aren't fighting. They are incredibly, fatally wrong. My babushka Yulia used to sit on the rotting wooden steps of our cramped apartment porch when I was a little girl. It was always in the stifling heat of July, the air thick with southern humidity and the smell of exhaust from Central Avenue. She would sit there in her floral housecoat, smoking these terrible, acrid, thin cigarettes that smelled like burning dried leaves, her sharp eyes tracking the movements of the neighborhood's stray cats as they hunted mice in the tall weeds. She took a long drag of her cigarette one afternoon, the glowing orange ember reflecting in her dark eyes, and she told me something when I was 10 years old that became the absolute bedrock foundation of my survival. "Look at the street cat, Oksana!" she rasped in her heavy, rolling Russian accent, pointing a bony, nicotine-stained finger at a mangy tabby crouching perfectly still in the grass. "The dog barks. The dog makes a grand show. The dog wastes all its energy announcing its anger to the world. But the rat? And the cat that hunts the rat?" She exhaled a thick plume of gray smoke into the humid air. "A rat only bites when it thinks you're asleep, and to catch it, you must pretend to be asleep." I didn't fully comprehend the dark gravity of her words then. "I thought she was just talking about the animals in the yard. I understand it perfectly now. I have lived it. Growing up, we didn't have anything." We shared a crumbling, drafty, one-bedroom apartment with peeling floral wallpaper and a radiator that clanked loudly all winter long. My mother, beautiful and exhausted, slept on a lumpy, spring-poking pull-out couch in the living room for 14 uninterrupted years, just so I could have the actual bedroom with a door that closed. She destroyed the cartilage in her knees kneeling on unforgiving concrete. She destroyed the delicate alveoli in her lungs, breathing in harsh, unventilated industrial bleach and ammonia, all so I could afford the tuition to go to community college and get my court reporting certification. So when her fragile lungs finally started failing 3 years ago, when the grim-faced pulmonologist looked at x-rays that resembled shattered glass and diagnosed her with severe, irreversible pulmonary fibrosis, there was absolutely no question in my mind about what I was going to do. I immediately moved her into my house. I became her primary, round-the-clock caretaker. I owed her my breath, my career, my entire life, and I was going to make absolutely certain that her final years on this earth were comfortable, dignified, and safe. That one singular thing about me, my absolute, stubborn, ferocious, unbreakable loyalty to the women in my bloodline, to my dying mother and my deaf daughter? Remember it, because it is the exact, specific reason this story ends with a powerful, arrogant man losing every single thing he valued in this world. When I first met Declan, I genuinely thought I had found my sanctuary. I really did. I thought the universe was finally giving me a reprieve. We met at Amelie's French Bakery in the bohemian Noda Arts District. It was pouring rain outside, a miserable, freezing Tuesday evening in late November. The bakery smelled intoxicatingly of roasted espresso beans, melting dark chocolate, and damp wool coats. I had just driven straight from the pediatric audiologist's office, clutching Mila's official devastating medical diagnosis in my trembling hands. I was sitting alone at a tiny, wobbly corner table, silently crying into a rapidly cooling cup of black coffee. I was completely, fundamentally overwhelmed by the terrifying reality of raising a special needs child entirely alone. My previous boyfriend had bolted for the door the absolute second the doctor had uttered the words, "profoundly deaf." Declan was sitting at the next table, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit that looked completely out of place among the starving artists and college students. He had been watching me. He reached across the aisle and gently handed me a crisp, white paper napkin. "Rough day?" he asked, his voice deep, soothing, and incredibly resonant. "You could say that," I whispered, wiping the mascara from my cheeks, embarrassed by my own vulnerability. "I'm Declan," he said, moving his chair slightly closer, "and I happen to be an exceptionally good listener. What's in the folder?" "It's my daughter," I said, my voice cracking, desperate for human connection. "She's deaf. I just found out today. The equipment, the therapies. I don't know how I'm going to do this alone." He didn't offer empty, patronizing platitudes. He didn't look away uncomfortably. He just sat with me, his dark eyes locked onto mine. "That's a massive challenge," Declan said softly, his gaze steady and reassuring. "But I've never been afraid of a challenge in my entire life. Most men run when things get hard. I don't." "Most men do run," I agreed, staring at my cold coffee. "I'm not most men." He smiled, a warm, charismatic smile that reached his eyes. "Let me buy you a fresh coffee. That one looks freezing." He was a regional logistics manager for a massive international shipping company. He was tall, broad-shouldered, charismatic, with this incredibly grounding, authoritative presence that made me feel like nothing bad could ever happen when he was in the room. He told me he loved kids. He told me he wanted a family more than anything. Looking back with the perfect, agonizing clarity of hindsight, the red flags weren't just flags. They were an entire synchronized parade marching down the street with brass bands. The way he ordered for me at restaurants without asking what I wanted. The way he casually criticized the clothes I wore. But I was so deeply exhausted, so incredibly desperate for a strong partner to help me carry the crushing weight of the world, that I willingly chose to view his intense, suffocating control as an umbrella of protection. Our first few years were beautiful, or at least the carefully constructed illusion of them was beautiful. We would take Mila to Freedom Park on sunny Sunday afternoons. He would hoist her up onto his broad shoulders and run around the sparkling lake, her silent, open-mouthed laughter echoing in the warm breeze. He spent hours sitting on the living room rug, watching grainy YouTube tutorials to learn basic American Sign Language. I vividly remember standing in the kitchen, wiping down the counters, and watching him clumsily sign, "I love you," to Mila across the room. My chest physically ached with such profound, overwhelming gratitude that it brought tears to my eyes. But a mask made of heavy plaster can only stay on a monster's face for so long before the straps start to dig into the skin, before the friction causes the true face beneath to bleed through. The first actual fracture happened subtly. We were having an expensive dinner at Fahrenheit, a rooftop restaurant, celebrating our 4th wedding anniversary. The glittering Charlotte skyline was glowing outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the white tablecloth in streaks of gold and neon blue. The table smelled of rich Wagyu beef and expensive red wine. I reached casually across the table to grab his cell phone, which was resting next to his fork, because my phone was buried deep inside my purse and I wanted to check the time for the babysitter. His massive hand shot out across the table and clamped down around my wrist. Hard. It was not a gentle tap. It was a visceral, bone-bruising, immobilizing grip. I actually felt the delicate bones in my wrist grind against each other under the pressure of his fingers. His dark eyes went completely flat. The warmth vanished instantly, leaving them dead, black, and completely empty, like a shark circling chum. "Don't touch my things," he said, his voice dropping an entire octave, barely above a whisper, vibrating with a terrifying, coiled violence. I was just checking the time," I stammered, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs in a primal fear response. "Then get your purse," he ordered, his grip tightening for a fraction of a second before he let go. I said, "Don't touch my things." "Declan, you're hurting me," I whispered, pulling my hand back. A split second later, the charm was back, washing over his face like a flipped switch. He laughed loudly, took a sip of his Cabernet, and smiled. "I'm sorry, babe. Corporate security policies. You know how my bosses are about data breaches. I'm just on edge. Gotta be careful." I sat in silence for the rest of the meal. I rubbed the angry red finger marks blooming on my pale skin under the table and desperately told myself it was just a reflex. Just stress from his demanding job. It wasn't a reflex. It was a warning. A month later, he hired a locksmith to install a heavy-duty, commercial-grade deadbolt on the solid oak door to his home office. He claimed it was because Mila was getting older, wandering the house more, and he had highly confidential client shipping files that couldn't be disturbed. 2 months after that, he started aggressively complaining about the mounting cost of my mother's medical care. It didn't start as a direct assault. It started with heavy, theatrical sighs at the kitchen island when the thick envelopes from the pharmacy arrived in the mail. It evolved into small, cutting remarks about how much electricity her vital oxygen concentrator was pulling from the grid. "We're basically running a private hospital wing, Oksana," he muttered one night, standing in the kitchen doorway, staring at a Duke Energy bill. "The power bill is up $40. Maybe she'd be more comfortable in a state facility." "She stays here," I said, my voice shaking slightly as I chopped carrots for a stew. "We agreed when we got married. We discussed this." "Things change, Oksana." He sighed, tossing the bill onto the granite counter. "She requires too much." "She is my mother," I pleaded, putting the knife down. "She has nowhere else to go." "She's a leech," he murmured under his breath. Then he smiled. It was a thin, terrible, humorless smile. "Right, of course. Because what Oksana wants, Oksana gets. God forbid we think about our actual financial future." That is the insidious, creeping nature of emotional abuse. It doesn't announce itself with a closed fist or a screaming match. It starts with a heavy sigh. It starts with a cruel joke made at your expense. It starts with the slow, methodical isolation of your support system until you look around one day and realize you are standing entirely alone on an island, surrounded by sharks. The escalation began in earnest right after my mother's pulmonary condition severely worsened, tethering her permanently to a hospital bed we had set up in the first-floor guest room. Beat one was the public disrespect. It was a sweltering Saturday afternoon in mid-July. Our wealthy next-door neighbors, the Millers, were hosting a neighborhood barbecue. The air was thick with humidity, the smell of hickory charcoal, and the loud splashing of kids in the pool. I was sitting in a folding lawn chair, sipping a glass of iced tea, having a quiet, pleasant conversation with Sarah Miller about the local elementary school's specialized IEP programs for deaf children. Declan walked up behind me, his large hands coming down to rest heavily on my bare shoulders. His fingers dug into my collarbone, feigning affection, but inflicting actual pain. "Oksana gets so hopelessly confused by the school district paperwork," he announced loudly, projecting his voice to make absolutely sure the other affluent husbands gathered around the smoking grill could hear him. "Her English is still a bit broken when she's stressed out. I have to step in and handle all the adult decisions for the family." "My English is completely, utterly flawless. I have zero accent. I am a certified superior court reporter. I transcribe highly complex, rapid-fire legal arguments, forensic pathology reports, and dense medical jargon at 225 words per minute for a living." I felt my face burn intensely hot with sudden, searing humiliation. Sarah Miller looked at me with pity. "My English is perfectly fine, Declan. I said quietly, trying to shrug his heavy hands off my shoulders. His fingers dug deeper, pressing into a nerve until I winced. Don't be so sensitive, babe. He chuckled warmly for the audience. It's a joke. You're always playing the victim. Can't you take a joke? Beat 2 was the spatial control. I came home from the courthouse one Tuesday at 4:15 p.m. The weather outside was mild, but the inside of the house felt weirdly drafty and hollow. I walked down the main hallway, my heels clicking on the wood, and stopped dead in my tracks. The heavy wooden door to Mila's bedroom was completely gone. It wasn't left open. It had been physically uncrewed and removed from the metal hinges. I panicked. I dropped my briefcase, ran down the hall to the master bathroom. That door was gone, too. The hinges were completely bare. Declan was sitting comfortably on the living room couch, drinking a beer, watching a PGA golf tournament on the television. Where are the doors? I demanded, my heart suddenly hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Declan, what did you do? Airflow, he said casually, not even bothering to look away from the glowing screen. The HVAC guy came by. He said the air circulation in this house is terrible. Plus, Mila spends way too much time hiding in her room playing with her toys. It's not healthy for her development. You took them off the hinges, I yelled, staring at the empty doorframe. She's a 7-year-old girl. She needs privacy to change her clothes. He slowly turned his head to look at me, his eyes dead and unblinking. My house, my mortgage, my doors. She spends all her time in her own little silent world anyway. If you don't like my rules, Oksana, you are more than welcome to pack up your sick, dying mother and your broken kid and go find a cheap apartment on Central Avenue again. I stopped breathing. The air turned to ice in my lungs. He had never, in our entire relationship, spoken about Mila like that. Broken. You know I can't leave, I whispered, the fight draining out of my body. You know I don't have the money for first and last month's rent anywhere. Exactly. He smiled, turning back to the golf tournament. So we're going to have better airflow. I didn't argue further. I couldn't. I was completely financially trapped. He had aggressively insisted on taking over management of all our household finances 2 years prior, claiming my stress levels from working and caring for my mother were dangerously high. He said he was doing me a favor. I still received my modest bi-weekly paycheck from the county courthouse, but it was direct deposited into a joint account that only he held the debit card and passwords for. Beat 3 was the replacement. It was mid-October. The leaves outside were turning brown. Mila was sitting cross-legged on the geometric living room rug, quietly playing with her favorite stuffed velvet rabbit. I sat down on the floor next to her, smelling the lingering scent of her baby shampoo, and reached out to help her tie the rabbit's long, floppy ears into a knot. Tangled deeply inside the worn velvet fabric of the toy was a single, incredibly long, thick strand of bleached blonde hair. I have jet black hair. Declan is a dark brunette. My poor mother, ravaged by heavy medications, has virtually no hair left on her scalp. I pulled the coarse blonde strand loose. I held it up to my nose. It smelled strongly of an expensive, cloying vanilla and amber perfume. Tom Ford, maybe? I held it up to the afternoon light filtering through the window. My stomach violently dropped into a cold, bottomless pit of realization. When Declan came home from work, hanging his keys on the hook, I walked up to him and held the blonde hair out between my fingers. Who was in the house today while I was at work? He didn't even blink. His heart rate didn't elevate. He possessed the moral compass of a starving hyena, but he was a truly exceptional, pathological liar. My mother, Sylvia, was here. She stopped by to drop off some junk mail that got sent to her house. Sylvia's hair is cut to her chin, Declan, I said, my voice trembling. And she smells like cheap rosewater, I said. This smells like vanilla. Are you calling my mother a liar? He snapped, stepping into my personal space, using his height to intimidate me. Are you interrogating me in my own home? I'm asking you why this was wrapped around my daughter's toy. You're acting crazy, Oksana, he sneered, brushing past me, intentionally bumping my shoulder with his chest. You're paranoid. Drop it before you make me angry. I told myself it was nothing. I shoved the intuition deep down into the dark basement of my mind. It wasn't nothing. Beat 4 was the public humiliation. It was Thanksgiving dinner. Declan had absolutely insisted we host his side of the family. His hypercritical mother Sylvia, his equally toxic sister Claire, and Claire's silent, terrible husband. I spent 2 grueling days in the sweltering kitchen cooking. I made a massive 20-pound turkey, 4 elaborate side dishes from scratch, and even attempted Sylvia's notoriously pretentious, complicated cranberry tart recipe. The house smelled of roasting meat, sage, and burning butter. My mother was resting in her bedroom down the hall, too physically weak and embarrassed by her oxygen tubes to join us at the formal dining table. We were sitting around the heavy mahogany table. Mila was quietly eating her mashed potatoes, her bright green eyes darting around the table, intently watching people's lips move, trying desperately to follow a conversation she couldn't hear. Sylvia, wearing a hideous floral blouse and reeking of her rotting rose perfume, took a slow, deliberate sip of her expensive white wine. She set the crystal glass down, looked directly across the table at me, and sighed heavily. It's just such a terrible shame, Declan, Sylvia said, her voice dripping with venomous fake sympathy that echoed loudly in the dining room. You work so incredibly hard for this family. You're such a handsome, successful, virile man. And yet you're trapped here, spending the best years of your life taking care of a mail-order mistake and a dying woman who refuses to pass on. You deserve a real family, a healthy family. The entire table went dead, agonizingly silent. The only sound was the clinking of Mila's fork against her porcelain plate. Excuse me? I whispered, my vision swimming with rage. Mom's just saying what everyone is thinking, Oksana. Claire chimed in, smirking over her wine glass. It's a huge burden on my brother. I looked desperately at my husband. I waited for him to defend me. I waited for the man who had handed me a napkin in the coffee shop, the man who had promised to protect us, to stand up, slam his fist on the table, and tell his mother to get the hell out of our house. Declan casually picked up his fork. He took a slow, deliberate bite of dry turkey. He chewed thoughtfully, swallowed, wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, and shrugged. It is what it is, Mom, he said smoothly, not even looking at me. We all carry our crosses in life. Some are just heavier than others. They are not crosses, I said, my voice shaking so violently I could barely form the words. They are your family. Calm down, Oksana, Declan snapped, his eyes flashing with warning. You're ruining the meal with your hysterics. I slowly stood up. I excused myself, walked stiffly into the guest bathroom, locked the door, turned on the sink faucet to a roaring blast so they wouldn't hear me, dropped to my knees on the cold tile, and violently vomited my entire dinner into the porcelain bowl. Cold sweat dripped from my forehead. Beat 5 was the spatial violation, the true, physical cruelty. I came home from the grocery store on a miserable, freezing Friday afternoon in December. Sleet was falling from the gray sky. I was carrying 3 heavy plastic bags of groceries, my fingers numb from the cold, mentally calculating how I was going to puree the chicken soup so my mother could swallow it without choking. I walked through the front door, the hinges squeaking, and immediately heard a strange, horrific, scraping sound echoing from the back hallway. I dropped the grocery bags instantly. A jar of applesauce shattered on the kitchen tile, splattering glass and fruit everywhere. I didn't care. I ran down the hallway. Declan and a massive, tattooed guy from his logistics warehouse were physically dragging my mother's heavy metal hospital bed out of her warm, first-floor bedroom. My mother was still lying in the bed. Her frail, skeletal hands were clutching the metal side rails so hard her knuckles were white. Her sunken eyes were wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. Her clear plastic oxygen tubing was stretched dangerously tight across the hardwood floor, straining against the heavy machine plugged into the wall. "What are you doing?" I screamed, my voice tearing my vocal cords. I dropped to my bruised knees, desperately unsnagging the plastic tubing before it ripped violently out of the machine and cut off her air supply. "We're moving her to the basement," Declan grunted, sweating through his expensive dress shirt as he shoved the heavy frame toward the top of the basement stairs. "The basement is damp! It floods!" I shrieked, pulling at his arm. "There's black mold down there. She has severe pulmonary fibrosis, Declan. The dampness will literally kill her." "The basement is fine," he snapped, shoving me away so hard I hit the wall. "I need this bedroom. I'm expanding my home office suite. I have important vice presidents from the shipping company coming over next month for a dinner meeting, and I absolutely cannot have the house smelling like a depressing hospital ward. Deal with it." "Please, Oksana," my mother wheezed, tears spilling down her wrinkled cheeks. "Don't let them." "Stop!" I begged, grabbing the metal rail. "Move, Oksana!" Declan growled, his voice dropping into that terrifying, violent octave. "Or I will move you." They forcefully dragged her bed down the steep, wooden stairs, the metal frame violently banging against the drywall, leaving deep gouges. They set her up in the darkest, most isolated corner of the unfinished basement, right next to the massive, roaring water heater. It was freezing down there. The cracked concrete floor radiated a bone-chilling cold. The air smelled of mildew and dust. I spent the entire night sitting on a rusted metal folding chair next to her bed, wrapped in a winter coat, holding her fragile, ice-cold hand. I listened to the loud, mechanical hum of the water heater and the rhythmic, desperate swoosh-click of her oxygen machine fighting to keep her alive. She looked at me in the dim, flickering light of the bare basement bulb, her eyes filled with profound shame and tears. "I am so sorry, my little bird," she whispered in Russian. "I am a burden to you. I am ruining your marriage." "You are not a burden," I said fiercely, kissing her paper-thin knuckles, my tears falling onto her skin. "You are my mother. I will fix this. I promise you." Beat 6 was the ally attack. Declan's sister, Claire, had started coming over more often, acting as his spy. She was just as entitled and toxic as her brother. One hazy Tuesday afternoon, I was standing at the kitchen sink, my hands deep in scalding, soapy dishwater, violently scrubbing a burnt pan. Claire was supposedly watching Mila in the living room while Declan was out in the garage. Suddenly, I heard a loud, terrifying crash of shattering plastic, followed instantly by Mila making a sharp, high-pitched, distressed vocalization, the sound she only made when she was in extreme pain or panic. I dropped the sponge and ran into the living room, my wet socks slipping on the hardwood. Mila was curled into a tight ball on the floor, sobbing hysterically, clutching the side of her head, pointing frantically to her ear. Lying on the brick hearth of the fireplace, shattered into 3 jagged pieces, was her highly expensive, surgically mapped cochlear implant external processor. Claire was standing over her, her arms crossed defensively over her chest, chewing a piece of gum. "What happened?" I demanded, dropping to my knees, gently prying Mila's hands away to check her scalp for blood. "She wasn't listening to me," Claire said smoothly, rolling her eyes. "I told the little brat to bring me the television remote. She completely ignored me. So I took that stupid, ugly computer off her head to get her attention, and it slipped out of my hand. She's fine. She's deaf, Claire, I screamed, the rage finally boiling over. She wasn't ignoring you. She was facing the window. She couldn't hear you. Well, maybe if you bothered to teach her to speak like a normal kid instead of doing those ridiculous, distracting hand gestures all the time, we wouldn't have this problem, Claire scoffed. Declan walked in from the garage, wiping grease off his hands with a rag. He surveyed the chaotic scene. He didn't check on Mila. He didn't ask if she was hurt. He looked directly at me. "Stop yelling at my sister in my house, Oksana," he ordered coldly. "Claire is a guest. You need to control your kid." "She broke Mila's processor," I yelled, holding up the shattered pieces of plastic and wire. "This costs $9,000, Declan. $9,000. "Then you better start saving your pennies," he said, turning around and walking back to the garage. "I'm not paying for it." My hands were shaking so violently as I gathered the shattered pieces of the processor that I deeply sliced my index finger on the cracked plastic casing. Bright red blood welled up and dripped onto the rug. I didn't care. I just held Mila against my chest as she cried into my neck, trapped in total silence. Beat 7 was the deliberate sabotage of her future. A few weeks after the processor was broken, I used a tiny bit of cash I had been secretly hiding in a coffee can to hire a specialized at-home American Sign Language tutor, Mrs. Gable. She was a kind, elderly deaf woman who agreed to come to the house twice a week for a discounted rate to help Mila stay on track with her language development while her equipment was broken. Mrs. Gable arrived on a Thursday afternoon. I was in the basement changing my mother's sheets. When I came upstairs, Mila was sitting on the living room floor alone, weeping silently. Mrs. Gable was nowhere to be seen. Declan was standing by the front door, slipping his wallet back into his pocket. "Where is Mrs. Gable?" I asked, a knot of dread forming in my throat. "I sent her home," Declan said casually. "We're done with that nonsense." "She's Mila's ASL tutor. I paid her in advance." "With money you stole from our budget," he countered, stepping toward me. I intercepted her on the porch. I told her her services were no longer required. Mila needs to learn how to read lips and fit into the real world. I am not having any more of this freakish hand-flapping in my house. It embarrasses me when we have guests. "You have absolutely no right to interfere with her cognitive development," I screamed, stepping forward, pushing his chest. "She needs language." He grabbed my shoulders and shoved me backward so hard I stumbled over the edge of the rug and fell. "I have every right," he sneered, looking down at me. "I am the man of this house. Now go make my dinner." Beat 8 was the institutional threat. The medical bills for the basement move, the replacement oxygen filters, and the attempt to repair the broken processor were piling up on the kitchen counter like a mountain of impending doom. I desperately asked Declan for access to our joint savings account to pay the pediatric audiologist so Mila could hear again. We were standing in the dim kitchen. It was 11:30 at night. The only light was the yellow glow from the stove hood. He laughed, a genuine, amused chuckle. "No." "Declan, please," I begged, my pride completely shattered. "She needs her processor fixed. She's falling severely behind in her second-grade classes. The teachers are concerned." "Then get a second job," he replied, opening the refrigerator to grab a beer. "Work weekends. I am not draining my hard-earned corporate salary into a bottomless pit of medical defects." "It's our money," I yelled, my voice cracking with desperation. "I put my entire courthouse paycheck into that account every single Friday. I have thousands of dollars in there." He slammed the refrigerator door shut. He stepped incredibly close to me, backing me aggressively against the stainless steel door. The cold metal pressed uncomfortably into my spine. He leaned down, his face inches from mine, his breath smelling heavily of stale scotch and mint toothpaste. "Let me make something absolutely crystal clear to you, Oksana," he whispered, his voice a razor blade in the dark. "If you ever raise your voice to me again, I will make one phone call to Adult Protective Services. I will tell the social workers that you are severely neglecting your dying mother in a moldy, freezing basement. I will tell them you are emotionally unstable and manic. They will legally remove her from this house and put her in a horrific state ward filled with strangers. And then, once she's gone, I will call Child Protective Services and tell them you're physically abusing Mila. I'll show them the bruises on her arm from when she fell off her bike." Who do you think a family court judge will believe? A highly successful, wealthy corporate executive or a hysterical, impoverished immigrant who types on a little machine for a living? I stopped fighting. The will to resist completely drained out of my body, leaving me a hollow shell. I went completely limp against the refrigerator. I nodded. I nodded like a pathetic idiot. Because apparently, marriage to a monster is just nodding silently while someone slowly, methodically dismantles your sanity piece by piece. But beat 9. The cruelest, most unimaginable moment. That was the moment the terrified victim finally died and the cold, calculating strategist was born. It was a bleak, windy Tuesday night in late January. The temperature outside had plummeted to a bitter 19 degrees. Frost coated the windows. I woke up at exactly 3:14 a.m. Something felt profoundly wrong in the house. The air felt too still. The house was too quiet. I slipped out from under the heavy duvet, careful not to disturb the mattress and wake Declan, who was snoring loudly beside me. I walked quietly down the dark hallway in my bare feet, shivering in the cold drafts. I opened the door to the basement stairs. Silence. Absolute, terrifying silence. The rhythmic, mechanical, life-sustaining swoosh click of my mother's heavy oxygen concentrator was completely gone. A blind, primal panic seized my throat, choking me. I flew down the steep wooden stairs in the pitch black, tripping over my own feet, violently scraping my shin on the sharp wooden edge of a step. I didn't feel the pain. I ran across the freezing concrete floor to my mother's bed. In the dim, sickly yellow light of the street lamp filtering through the tiny, dirty basement window, I saw her. She was thrashing weakly against the tangled, sweat-soaked bedsheets. Her frail hands were clawing at her own throat. Her mouth was wide open in a silent, desperate "oh," pulling at air that wasn't there. Her face, her lips, her eyelids were all tinted a horrifying, bruised shade of blue. She was suffocating to death in the dark. "Mama!" I shrieked, grabbing the clear plastic oxygen tubing that ran to her face mask. I traced it frantically back to the heavy machine sitting on the floor. The three-pronged electrical plug wasn't just pulled out of the wall socket. It hadn't accidentally fallen out. The thick, heavy black power cord had been deliberately, methodically unplugged, tightly wound up, and shoved deep underneath the heavy base of the machine to hide it. Someone had intentionally unplugged her life support, wound it up, and hidden the cord so she couldn't reach it. I fell to my knees, sobbing hysterically, yanking the heavy machine back, grabbing the cord, and violently jamming the plug back into the wall outlet. The machine beeped loudly, roared to life with a mechanical shudder, and the rich, pure oxygen began flowing through the tubes. The smell of ozone and electricity filled the air. I placed the mask firmly over my mother's face. I rubbed her frail chest, weeping, whispering frantic prayers to her in Russian until her chest began to rise and fall normally, and the terrifying blue color slowly started to recede from her lips, replaced by a pale, sickly pink. I didn't go back to sleep. I sat on the freezing, cracked concrete floor next to her bed, holding her hand, staring into the dark corner of the basement until 6 a.m. When I finally walked heavily up the stairs, exhausted and hollowed out, Declan was standing in the bright, sunlit kitchen, casually pouring a cup of expensive French roast coffee. He was wearing his perfectly tailored, charcoal gray suit, looking like a magazine cover. I stood in the doorway, my clothes wrinkled, my shin bleeding through my pajama pants. "The oxygen machine was unplugged last night," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. He didn't look up from his cell phone screen. "Yeah, it's incredibly loud." The humming was vibrating up through the wooden floorboards into the guest room above it. I couldn't sleep. Plus, it uses way too much power. She doesn't need it 24/7. She's just being dramatic to get your attention. He had deliberately suffocated a dying woman in the dead of night so he wouldn't have to hear a faint hum through the floorboards. He took a slow, appreciative sip of his steaming coffee. "Make sure my dry cleaning is picked up by 5 o'clock today. I have a dinner meeting." He walked right past me, smelling of expensive cologne, and walked out the front door. The lock clicked shut behind him. That was beat 9. The absolute breaking point. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't take a heavy coffee mug and smash it into the drywall. Instead, I felt a profound, absolute, terrifying stillness settle over my brain. It was as if someone had poured liquid nitrogen over my raging emotions, freezing them solid. It was the quietest, most focused my mind had been in 9 years. I walked into the master bathroom, turned on the faucet, splashed freezing cold water onto my pale face, and looked deeply at myself in the mirror. I looked at the dark circles under my eyes. I looked at the gray hairs at my temples. Babushka Yulia's raspy, smoke-filled voice echoed perfectly in my head. "A rat only bites when it thinks you're asleep." He thought I was broken. He thought I was beaten. I was going to let him think I was in a deep, irreversible coma. I called the courthouse and left a voicemail saying I was violently ill. I drove Mila to her specialized school and dropped her off with a kiss on the forehead. And then I drove my unreliable, sputtering sedan 40 minutes outside of Charlotte to a strange, run-down little spy gear shop located in a depressing strip mall in Gastonia. The shop smelled heavily of stale cigarettes and cheap electronics. The owner, a paranoid, sweaty man behind bulletproof glass, didn't ask any questions. I took out $400 in crisp $20 bills, money I had been painstakingly, secretly hoarding inside a hollowed-out hardcover dictionary for 2 years, and purchased 3 high-definition, motion-activated hidden cameras equipped with infrared night vision, crystal-clear audio recording, and encrypted cloud storage capabilities. I wasn't a tech expert. I didn't possess any fancy professional espionage skills. I was just a terrified, desperate mother who sat in the driver's seat of her car in the greasy parking lot of a Wendy's, eating cold French fries, meticulously reading the tiny instruction manuals until I understood exactly how they worked. I drove home. I waited until I was absolutely certain the house was empty. I installed the first camera inside the plastic casing of the smoke detector in the living room ceiling, angling it perfectly to capture the couch and the front door. I installed the second camera directly behind a stack of dusty, heavy encyclopedias on the bookshelf in Declan's locked home office. I knew he arrogantly kept the spare brass key hidden in the side pocket of his golf bag in the garage. I installed the third, most crucial camera directly above my mother's bed in the damp basement, disguising the tiny lens inside a functional carbon monoxide detector. And then I waited. I endured. For 3 agonizing, humiliating months, I played the part of the broken, subservient wife perfectly. I let him belittle my intelligence at dinners. I let his terrible mother insult my cooking. I let him control the thermostat, the grocery list, the bank accounts. I shrank myself down to the size of a mouse. But every single night, while he was snoring loudly in our bed, I would sit on the toilet seat in the locked bathroom, the glow of my cell phone illuminating my face. I would log into a secure encrypted server and download gigabytes of high-definition video and audio files to a hidden, encrypted flash drive. What I saw on those cameras over the next 12 weeks would have completely shattered a weaker woman. I saw him bringing a woman into our house while I was at the courthouse working. Her name was Chloe, a 24-year-old marketing assistant from his logistics company. She had long, coarse blonde hair. She wore heavy Tom Ford vanilla perfume. I watched, my face completely blank, as they drank my expensive wine on my living room couch, their bodies tangled together. I listened to their conversations through the crystal-clear audio feeds. "How much longer do I have to wait, Deck?" Chloe whined one rainy afternoon, tracing her manicured fingernail along his jawline on the sofa. "I hate sneaking around this depressing house. It smells like old people." "Not long, babe. I promise," Declan said smoothly, rubbing her bare shoulders, kissing her neck. "The lawyer says the paperwork is almost ready. I'm legally severing my parental rights to the deaf kid. I'm not paying a dime of child support for a broken unit, and the old bat in the basement won't last the winter anyway. I go down there and unplug her machine every chance I get to speed up the process. Once she finally croaks, Oksana will completely snap from the grief. I'll have her committed to a state psych ward as a danger to herself. I'll legally take sole possession of the estate, and we'll sell this house for a massive profit." He was actively trying to starve out a dying woman, abandon a disabled child to the brutal foster system, and lock his wife in a mental institution just so he could cash out. But I didn't strike. I didn't confront him. I didn't go to the police. Not yet. I was a court reporter. I knew that in the eyes of the law, infidelity and cruel talk weren't enough to destroy him completely. I needed the final, fatal piece of the puzzle. I needed to know exactly where the money was. Because 2 weeks prior, a harsh-voiced collection agency had called my cell phone while I was on my lunch break. Our mortgage hadn't been paid in 5 months. The house was in active pre-foreclosure. Where was his massive, 6-figure corporate salary going? That crucial question brings us right back to the insurance appraiser, the thunderstorm, and the heavy metal lockbox. In late March, a massive, violent thunderstorm rolled through the Charlotte area. High winds snapped a massive, rotting oak branch from the tree in our front yard, sending it crashing violently into our roof, severely damaging the shingles and the plywood directly above the attic space. Declan, absolutely furious about the potential repair costs, aggressively filed an insurance claim. The insurance company sent an independent appraiser named Elias. He was an older, quiet man, maybe 60 years old, with kind, weathered eyes, a thick gray beard, and a heavy canvas tool bag slung over his shoulder. Declan let him into the house, irritably pointed a finger at the attic access panel in the hallway ceiling, told him not to make a mess, and then went straight back into his home office, slamming and locking the heavy door behind him. I was standing quietly in the kitchen, boiling water to make chamomile tea for my mother. Elias pulled down the squeaking wooden ladder and climbed up into the dark, stifling heat of the attic. I could hear his heavy work boots walking slowly across the wooden plywood joists directly above my head. He was up there for a long time. 45 minutes. Much, much longer than a standard routine roof inspection required. When he finally climbed down the ladder, he didn't walk to Declan's office door to give his report. He walked straight down the hallway and into the kitchen. His flannel shirt was covered in pink fiberglass insulation dust. He looked deeply troubled. He looked at me, his eyes darting down the hallway to visually confirm that the office door was still tightly closed. Then he reached his thick, calloused hand deep inside his heavy canvas tool bag. He pulled out a heavy black metal lockbox covered in a thick layer of dust. "Ma'am," Elias whispered, his voice trembling slightly, his eyes filled with a deep, knowing sorrow. "I've been doing this job for 30 hard years. I know exactly what I'm looking at when I evaluate storm damage. And I know exactly what I'm looking at when I see a man hiding something terrible from his wife. This box was shoved deep, deep inside the insulation cavity near the soffit vents at the very edge of the roofline. The fiberglass around it was freshly disturbed. It hasn't been up there long. He handed me the box. It was incredibly heavy, the cold metal biting into my skin. Is there water damage up there? I asked, my voice barely a breath. No water damage, Elias whispered, tapping the side of his nose with a dusty finger. Just a few broken shingles. As far as my official report goes, I didn't find a single thing up there except wood. I'm just going to write up the roof damage estimate and leave. Good luck to you, ma'am. He turned around, walked out the front door, and drove away in his truck. I never saw him again, but that quiet, observant man was my absolute savior. I took the heavy metal box into the guest bathroom, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the bathtub. The box was secured with a cheap, 3-digit combination lock. I knew Declan's predictable habits. I tried his birth date. Nothing. I tried our anniversary. Nothing. I tried Chloe's birthday, which I had heard him mention on the hidden cameras. Click. The metal latch popped open with a loud snap. Inside the box was a thick, neatly banded stack of official cashier's checks, municipal bearer bonds, and a pristine, handwritten financial ledger. I pulled the ledger out. I tallied the numbers in my head. The total was exactly $333,000. He had secretly opened a massive home equity line of credit against our house, digitally forged my signature on the electronic bank documents, and systematically drained every single penny of equity we had built over 9 years. He was legally stealing my home. Beneath the stacks of money was a thick manila folder. I opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was the official deed to a massive, 4-bedroom, newly constructed house in a luxury subdivision in South Carolina, purchased entirely in cash. The legal names printed clearly on the deed were Declan Vance and Chloe Vance. They weren't even married yet, and she was already using his last name on legal documents. And at the very bottom of the metal box, paper-clipped together, was the final draft of the legal surrender documents his lawyer had prepared. Petitions to the state family court to terminate his parental rights, explicitly citing severe maternal mental instability and the child's overwhelming, financially ruinous medical needs. My hands didn't shake. I didn't cry a single tear. The liquid nitrogen in my veins kept me perfectly steady. I took my cell phone out of my pocket. I meticulously, clearly photographed every single legal document, every cashier's check, the deed, and every page of the handwritten ledger. I put the papers back into the box exactly, precisely how I had found them. I closed the lid, locked the combination, quietly climbed up the squeaky attic ladder, and shoved the box right back deep into the pink fiberglass insulation exactly where Elias had found it. Then I walked into the hallway, just as Declan finally opened his office door. "Did the roof guy leave?" He grunted, rubbing his eyes. "Yes," I said smoothly, my voice perfectly level. "He just pulled out of the driveway." "And? What did he say? Is it going to cost me a fortune?" "No," I replied, looking him dead in his dark eyes. "He said the damage is minor." "Just a few shingles." "Good." Declan sighed, stretching his broad shoulders. "At least something isn't draining my wallet today. Make me a sandwich." "Turkey or ham?" I asked politely. "Turkey, extra mayonnaise. Don't skimp on it." I went to the kitchen. I made him his sandwich. I put extra mayonnaise on it, exactly the way he liked it. I served it to him on a plate with a smile. I waited 3 more agonizing weeks. I needed him to formally, legally file his fraudulent paperwork with the county clerk so that the trap would snap shut directly on his neck, not just catch his leg. On a rainy Tuesday morning, a knock came at the front door. A sheriff's deputy handed me the thick packet of legal summons. Declan had officially filed for emergency, ex parte sole possession of the house, temporary restraining orders barring me from the property, and the involuntary psychiatric hold petition designed to lock me in a hospital. The emergency hearing was scheduled for Friday morning at the Mecklenburg County Family Court. Phase 6. The Grand Reversal. The courtroom was heavily paneled in dark, imposing oak. The air smelled of lemon floor wax and old paper. Judge Caldwell, a notoriously strict, no-nonsense woman with sharp gray eyes and a reputation for destroying unprepared lawyers, presided high above us on the bench. Declan sat confidently at the petitioner's table with a highly expensive, incredibly slick, aggressive lawyer named Harrison. Declan was wearing a bespoke charcoal suit, a silk tie, and a gold watch. He looked completely relaxed. He looked victorious. He didn't even glance in my direction. I sat completely alone at the respondent's table. I didn't have a lawyer. I couldn't afford one. I just had a cheap 90-cent manila folder and a small silver USB drive resting on the wood in front of me. Harrison stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and delivered an absolute masterclass in legal character assassination. He paced the floor, his voice booming with theatrical concern. He painted a vivid, horrifying picture of me as a deeply disturbed, financially irresponsible, hysterical immigrant woman who was actively, medically abusing her own dying mother by forcing her to live in a moldy basement and severely neglecting the educational needs of her deaf daughter. "Your Honor," Harrison concluded smoothly, resting his hands on the podium, looking up at the judge with feigned sadness. "Mr. Vance is simply a desperate man trying to protect his hard-earned assets and ensure his vulnerable stepdaughter and sick mother-in-law become wards of the state where they can finally receive proper, safe medical care. Meanwhile, he is asking the court to ensure his wife receives the intensive psychiatric help she so desperately needs in a secure facility." Judge Caldwell adjusted her reading glasses. She looked down at me, her expression unreadable. "Ms. Volkoff, you are completely unrepresented by counsel today. Do you have a response to these extremely severe, life-altering allegations?" I slowly stood up. The wooden chair squeaked loudly against the floor. I smoothed the wrinkles out of my inexpensive gray skirt. I looked at the stenographer sitting in the corner, her hands hovering over the keys, ready to record my destruction. "I do, Your Honor," I said, my voice ringing out clear, steady, and perfectly devoid of fear. "I have a response to the allegations, and I have one piece of physical evidence I would like submitted to the court at this time. It is a video file." Harrison stood up immediately, his face flushing with anger. "Objection, Your Honor! Unverified evidence! We haven't seen any video files during the discovery process. This is a blatant violation of court procedure." "This is an emergency ex parte hearing, Mr. Harrison," Judge Caldwell snapped, banging her gavel lightly. "You brought this woman here with 3 days' notice. Normal discovery rules are relaxed in emergency injunctions. The court will view the evidence. Bailiff, assist the respondent." I handed the bailiff the small silver USB drive. He walked it over and plugged it into the court's presentation laptop sitting below the bench. The massive 80-inch flat-screen monitor mounted on the courtroom wall flickered to life. Declan leaned back in his leather chair, a smug, condescending little smile playing on his lips. He thought I was going to show a pathetic, shaky cell phone video of Mila crying, or my mother looking frail and sick, to garner cheap emotional sympathy from the judge. The video started playing. It was the hidden basement camera angle. The screen was bathed in the eerie, glowing green hue of infrared night vision. The digital timestamp in the bottom right corner flashed brightly. 3:14 a.m. The courtroom was completely, utterly silent. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents. On the massive screen, Declan walked casually into the frame. He was wearing his expensive silk pajamas. He walked over to my mother's hospital bed. He stood over her frail, sleeping body for a long, terrible, agonizing moment, just watching her breathe. Then, with sudden, vicious violence, he reached down, gripped the thick black power cord of the oxygen machine, and violently yanked it out of the wall socket. He didn't stop there. The high-definition camera perfectly caught the malicious intent as he carefully wrapped the thick cord up, tucked it deep underneath the heavy base of the machine to hide it, and stood back up. On the video, my mother immediately began to thrash against the sheets. The awful, wet, desperate, gasping sound of a woman physically suffocating to death filled the courtroom speakers, echoing off the oak walls. Gasp, choke, thrash. Declan stood there, his hands in his pajama pockets, and casually watched her violently struggle for 30 agonizing seconds. Then he smiled, turned around, and walked up the stairs, leaving her to die in the dark. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that has a physical weight, pressing down on your chest. The stenographer in the corner had completely stopped typing, her mouth hanging open in horror. I didn't look at the screen. I looked directly at Declan. His face had gone completely, utterly, violently white. The smug, arrogant smile vanished instantly, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated, primal terror. His eyes were wide, the pupils blown out. He looked exactly like a man who had confidently stepped off a cliff in the dark and suddenly realized there was no ground beneath him. His expensive lawyer, Harrison, physically pushed his leather chair away from Declan, as if sitting near him would legally contaminate him. "Your Honor," I said, my voice cutting through the silent room like a diamond blade. "That man on the screen is my husband, intentionally unplugging life-saving medical equipment to, in his own documented words, speed up the process." Before the stunned judge could speak, I pressed the spacebar on the presentation laptop on my table. The next video file played immediately. It was the hidden living room camera, broad daylight, high definition. Declan was lying on my couch with Chloe, the blonde marketing assistant. The audio was crystal clear, completely undeniable. "I'm legally severing my parental rights to the deaf kid." Declan's voice echoed through the courtroom speakers. "I'm not paying child support for a broken unit, and the old bat in the basement won't last the winter. Once she croaks, Oksana will completely snap, I'll have her committed to a psych ward, and we'll sell the house." I pressed pause. The image froze on Declan kissing his mistress. I looked up at Judge Caldwell. The judge's face was a mask of cold, terrifying, righteous fury. Her knuckles were white where she gripped her pen. "Furthermore, Your Honor," I said, calmly opening my cheap manila folder, "I have highly detailed photographic evidence of a black metal lockbox currently hidden deep inside the attic insulation of the marital home. It contains exactly $333,000 in diverted stolen funds from a fraudulently forged home equity line of credit, alongside the cash deed to a newly constructed property in South Carolina purchased exclusively for his mistress, Chloe." I handed the thick stack of glossy photographs to the bailiff, who practically ran them up to the judge's bench. Declan stood up. His large hands were shaking so violently he knocked over his crystal water glass. It shattered violently against the hardwood floor, water and glass spraying everywhere. She manipulated that," Declan stammered, his deep, authoritative voice cracking into a high, pathetic, reedy pitch. Sweat was pouring down his forehead. "She's crazy. That's AI. That's fake. It's a deep fake. I didn't do that." Judge Caldwell stood up and slammed her heavy wooden gavel down onto the sounding block so hard the sharp crack echoed like a gunshot in the confined space. "Sit down, Mr. Vance," she roared, her voice vibrating with absolute, terrifying authority. "Sit down immediately before I have my bailiffs shackle you to that chair." Declan's knees buckled. He collapsed heavily into his chair, gasping for air. Harrison, his lawyer, slowly stood up. He calmly gathered his legal pads, snapped his expensive leather briefcase shut, and looked directly at the judge, completely ignoring his client. "Your Honor, I formally request the court's permission to withdraw as counsel for Mr. Vance, effective immediately. I cannot represent this." "Granted, Mr. Harrison," the judge said coldly. Harrison walked out of the courtroom without looking back once. I methodically packed my papers back into my 90-cent folder. I pulled the silver USB drive from the laptop. I walked slowly past Declan's table toward the heavy double doors. He was staring blankly at the shattered glass on the floor, sweating profusely, breathing in rapid, ragged, terrified gasps. The monster was completely broken. I stopped walking. I leaned down, bringing my mouth just a few inches from his ear. I could smell his sweat and his expensive cologne. "A rat only bites when it thinks you're asleep," I whispered into his ear. I stood up, pushed open the heavy oak doors, and walked out of the courtroom, stepping into the blindingly bright, warm Carolina sunshine. The cascade of legal and personal consequences was incredibly swift, and it was absolute. Within 2 hours, Judge Caldwell had permanently granted me emergency sole possession of the house, legally frozen every single one of Declan's bank accounts and assets, and issued a permanent, heavily restrictive restraining order. But it didn't end in the civil family court. Judge Caldwell immediately forwarded the high-definition video of the oxygen machine to the Mecklenburg County District Attorney's office. 3 days later, 2 armed detectives walked into Declan's massive logistics warehouse. They arrested him in handcuffs in the middle of the loading dock, right in front of his boss and all his employees. He was officially charged with attempted murder of a vulnerable adult, felony elder abuse, and major corporate financial fraud regarding the forged bank documents and the HELOC loan. His company fired him immediately, citing moral turpitude. Chloe, the young mistress, absolutely panicked when the police detectives started aggressively asking questions about the cash-purchased South Carolina house. She instantly turned state's evidence to save herself from conspiracy charges, testifying tearfully that Declan had openly bragged to her about forging my signature on the bank documents. She abandoned him the exact second the money dried up. His mother, Sylvia, tried to call my cell phone a month later. She left a weeping, desperate, pathetic voicemail, begging me to speak to the DA, begging me to tell them it was all just a terrible misunderstanding. She sobbed that her handsome, successful son was suffering terribly in the violent county jail, that he was losing his mind in a tiny cell. I didn't call her back. I took the audio file of her weeping voicemail, downloaded it onto a cheap flash drive, and threw it directly into the kitchen trash can. It has been 2 years since that day in court. Declan, completely out of money and abandoned by everyone, took a desperate plea deal to avoid a 20-year jury sentence. He is currently serving 8 hard years in a medium-security state prison in the sweltering heat of eastern North Carolina. He has no money, no property, and absolutely no family left who will accept his collect calls. I sold the house in Charlotte for a massive profit. I took the remaining equity and the fully recovered $333,000, and I bought a beautiful, sprawling, single-story ranch house in the quiet, tree-lined suburbs of Huntersville. There are no stairs in this house. There is no dark, damp basement. My mother has a massive, sun-drenched bedroom on the first floor with huge bay windows that look out onto a vibrant, blooming flower garden. Her oxygen machine hums quietly in the corner of the room all day and all night, and absolutely nobody ever complains about the noise. Mila is 9 years old now. She is thriving at an incredible, specialized private school for the deaf. She is fierce, she is brilliant, she is loud in her own way, and most importantly, she is completely safe. Yesterday morning, I was sitting in a rocking chair on our new, wraparound back porch, drinking a steaming cup of coffee. The air was crisp and cool. The sun was just coming up over the tree line, painting the morning sky in breathtaking, brilliant shades of gold, pink, and bruised purple. Mila ran out onto the wooden porch, wearing her favorite flannel pajamas, her bare feet slapping against the wood. She looked at me, smiled her massive, beautiful, missing tooth smile, and raised her small hands into the air. She signed, "I am happy." I set my heavy ceramic coffee mug down. I raised my hands. I signed back, "I love you." I took another slow sip of my coffee. I closed my eyes and listened to the quiet, beautiful, rhythmic swoosh click of my mother's oxygen concentrator drifting through the open window behind me. I am Oksana Volkov. I am a court reporter. I am quiet. I wear gray sweaters and I blend into the background. I am practically invisible to the world, and I completely, utterly destroyed the monster in my house without ever raising my voice.